Welcome to the Sports Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Luer, and I'm excited to have another good friend on the line with me here today, Mr. Phil Lyons.
Hi, Marcus.
Hi, Phil. But before we get going, I'd really love to share a little bit of the illustrious career Phil had. He started as a sports journalist in 1973, moved on to the BBC and spent a certain amount of time at ITV, where I believe we actually ended up doing some work together for the first time. A big part of his career was spent with the Premier League as director of international broadcast, and we're definitely going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the amazing things Phil did at that time. He then had a sting with CAA Sports as well as Lagadere until he settled in now with his own consultancy company called Nootka. So welcome to the podcast, Phil, and I'm excited to explore the world of broadcast and everything you've done in your career here. I think it's going to be exciting to debate all this. And as we always do here, we kind of start off a bit of warm up, a bit of storytelling. And I'd love to hear a little more from you about when you set up the sports news television agency. How did that start, and how did that sort of shape your career?
Thanks, Marcus. It's a pleasure to be talking to you, as always. Yeah, it's funny, really. I am the poacher termed gamekeeper when it comes to sports rights, because the reason that I got into sports rights and learned so much about them came from when I set up a sports television. I think I can actually claim that it was the world's first television sports news agency.
Right.
And the way it came about was that I was working for a television news agency called Viz News, which was basically sending out, in those days it was actually tapes shipped on planes rather than satellite feeds, but they were sending out a certain number of news stories every day to broadcasters around the world to use in their news bulletins. I looked at this and said, well, why don't you do a separate sports news service? And they said, well, how do we know it would work? And I said, well, if you give me a month and a budget to do some traveling, I'll go out and try and sign you some contracts, which they surprisingly agreed to. I went to South America for two reasons. Number one, I was a young man and I wanted to see South America. Yeah. Number two, I knew they were crazy about sport down in South America. So I did that. I toured South America for a month. The only country I didn't get into was Argentina because a little thing called the Falklands War cropped up in the middle of it. But I came back with a bunch of contracts, and I realized that this was a goer. And through that, I learned about something called news access, which basically gave the broadcasters the permission, the ability to show short extracts of sports events in their news bulletins. But it was through learning about news access that I started to think much more about sports rights. Right. Who was buying them, who was selling them, how that all worked.
Which year was this? The one what we're talking about right now?
This was in the early 80s. This was like 82, something like that. And actually, the sports news service went on to be a big success. Of course, what I learned many years later was that I should have done that as me. I should have set it up myself. Then I would have made a lot of money. But of course, I wasn't the budding young entrepreneur at that time. But it was a success. And actually, it was from doing that I then went fully into sports rights with ISL, if you remember ISL.
Of course, yes.
I set up the ISL television operation for them. So that then I was in sports rights proper. And the next thing I did was not for an agency. The next thing I did was to work for Bernie Ecclestone for a short time, selling Formula One rights. So then I was kind of up and running as a sports rights salesman. And it's funny because if you'd said to me, what did I want to be when I was young, I always said I wanted to be a journalist. Somehow that got kind of twisted into from the print media into television, and then suddenly ended up finding that I really enjoyed trading sports rights.
Awesome. When you were with ISL, what were the rights you were dealing with? Was it Football World Cup or the Olympics, or which were the rights you were working
with? Both of those.
Both of those.
Basically, the late Horst Dassler of Adidas had set up ISL, and he had got the commercial rights to both the Olympics and the Football World Cup.
That's right.
Pretty amazing. And there were some chunky deals in place for television rights for both of those. So, for example, with the European Broadcasting Union, which covered the whole of Europe, but there were a bunch of territories which weren't covered, and those are the ones we went out and sold those rights to. So I started off with some pretty good rights.
Yeah, no, I know the ISL story quite well. I actually, my career literally started with ISL as well, in a much smaller way. I was working with them in 1994 at the Football World Cup, which was still when ISL was still around. Obviously, a few years later, they sort of imploded. But yeah, ISL is an incredible company, and obviously has some illustrious alumni around the world, like yourself.
Absolutely, yeah. I left, thankfully, long before it all turned a bit sour. I do remember, funnily enough, I remember the first World Cup I went to, which was in Mexico. And I remember that at that stage, ISL wasn't very happy with the coverage from the Mexican host broadcaster. And I had to go around and try and sweeten all the cameramen.
Yeah, that, I can imagine. I mean, like I said, '94 was already, compared to what we talk about now, is like the Wild West. But in the days you were in there, I can only imagine how that feed was coming out of that building or out of the venue.
It's interesting. I'm told that, I mean, like the 1966 World Cup, the one here in the UK, there was actually no advertising boards around the pitch.
Yeah.
Believe it or not. I think the first one that was commercialized at all was 1970, and I'm told that if you look at old film, I think it was film of 1970, that just as the first whistle is about to blow for the first match of the 1970 World Cup, you'll see Pelé on the center circle bend down and retie his bootlace, and you'll see the cameraman going close on the boot. I think that is probably where it all began.
That's right. Yep, I've heard about that story too, and I actually recently read somewhere he was paid something like, I can't remember, $100,000 or $200,000 to do it. So this wasn't by accident. He did it on purpose.
No, absolutely.
And he was obviously paid a good amount of money for it. Yeah, so those are great stories there. That's for sure. Now, I'm sure we could be talking. We maybe come back to a bit later, but I'd love to also, and still in our sort of warm up session here, jump into the Premier League, because it's clearly that's such a big big league, as well as what you did is so dramatic and tremendous. So I'd love you to share with us a little bit of course, how you got in it maybe, and then some of these numbers which are staggering of how this league grew during your time and beyond.
Well, there's a lot of people, Marcus, who have congratulated me about my stroke of marketing genius to introduce the midday Premier League match here in the UK, saying, wow, wasn't that a clever thing to do, because it's prime time in Asia, and that really helped you. Right? Yeah, exactly. And actually, as much as I'd love to claim it as marketing genius, it really wasn't. It was down to a police decision in the UK. Really? At that time, they were a little concerned that that people were going to be going to big matches a little bit worse for wear with alcohol. And so they wanted to introduce an early kickoff, and any matches where they were worried about this, they could put into this early kickoff slot.
Wow.
Now, the great thing for me was that all the matches they were worried about were, the big local derbies.
Of course.
Yeah, like Manchester United, Liverpool, Spurs, Arsenal, etc. Yep. So those were the kind of matches that were being shifted to the early kickoff on Saturday, which, of course, was going out at prime time in Asia. So, that really did help. But as much as I'd love to claim that as genius, it wasn't anything like that at all.
Interesting. Yeah, never read that, I have to admit. But that's great. That's a great story.
I think there's a whole bunch of different reasons. People are always asking me, what's the reason for the success of Premier League internationally? And I say, hey, it's not one thing. Setting up Premier League TV with IMG to make sure that all of the output was consistently good and properly badged. That, I think that was important. We did a lot of good stuff with the broadcasters. We set up a workshop so they could come to London, and the producers would come to London every year, and we'd talk about what we liked, what they liked, what we didn't like. We even had the producers' mobile numbers, so we could text them if there was any kind of delay due to bad weather or something with a kickoff. We provided a really good service, I will say that, and I think that paid off for us. I think the other thing,
the numbers are there, right? I mean, you said something like 60 million to almost 500 million was the increase, which was staggering. Maybe talk a bit about that.
It was a huge increase. Yeah, I mean, when I first went there, they had just completed a deal overseas, and I basically said to Richard, we've got to stop selling matches to agencies. We've got to start selling directly to broadcasters.
Right.
I'm not saying if an agency wants to come in and pay more than we're being offered by a broadcaster, sure, let them take the risk.
Yep.
But primarily, there's no reason to let anyone else take a percentage out of the chain. And there were some big numbers, big percentages being taken out of the chain, believe me. Agents were getting the rights from the Premier League and doubling them, and you don't want that.
Yep. No, there's always that. That's what agencies do. That's for sure.
That's what they do, and good luck to them if they can do it. But I was on the other side then, and basically said, no, we need to stop this, and we need to establish a direct relationship with the broadcasters. I remember going down to Johannesburg, seeing the guys down there at Super Channel in South Africa, and bearing in mind this is like 2002, and the Premier League had started in '92, so they'd had the rights from the start. They'd never met anyone from the Premier League. I was the first person they met. So that no one had ever. There wasn't a TV guy at the Premier League. No one had gone out and spoken and met with all these broadcasters and got to know them and what they needed and what worked for them. So we did that, and I think that has a big effect. Then, of course, you get kind of a virtuous circle in that the more money's coming in, as you well know, Marcus, the money goes straight through to the clubs who spend all the money on players.
Yep.
I used to joke at one point that the Bentley, the car manufacturer, should give me a contract. And someone said, why? I said, well, because I bring in all this money for the Premier League. Premier League give it to the clubs. Clubs give it to the players, and the players buy baby Bentleys. And we might as well cut out all the middlemen, I could give the money straight to them.
It could have been a nice business there.
But what the clubs did spend money on, which really helped me, was players from other countries.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of win-win. I was getting more money, giving the money to the clubs. The clubs were spending it on more players, making the product more attractive, to a point where I used to say we essentially had a world league that happened to be played in Britain, which was very nice, very good.
I think that's a great point, and we've seen it all the time. Where if you have local stars who then obviously are transported to another part of the world, the rights fees and the attention from the local market then just explodes. And clearly that's exactly what you guys done with that new money coming in, bringing in the Ronaldos of the world into the league. Easy to see how that all spiraled into the right direction there.
Yeah, I don't think there are many people who work as salesmen that see so much of the revenue they bring in go into the product. Yeah. I mean, that's really what it's down to. You can talk about player agents taking money out, but so much of the money was spent by the clubs. They weren't keeping. In those days, the clubs were not making any money themselves. They were just spending it all on players. But you can say, in retrospect, and I don't think this is something that you can credit them for thinking at the time, but they built this huge global property. Yeah. I don't think they were doing it. They were just doing it because they wanted the best players to win matches.
Absolutely.
But they did. They spent a lot of the money businesses, I think if you speak to any kind of business guru now, they'll say, well, all your early revenue needs to be plowed back into the product and build the product.
Yep.
That's what they
And
did
that's what they
unwittingly.
did. Yeah, correct,
Yeah.
correct. Without, yeah, that's probably wasn't the plan. Now, I'd love to touch on one other thing here. And I remember um, when you were with the league, you guys ran some very, very sophisticated tender processes, where tenders not just obviously for the local market, but globally, were run with a host of different nuances on the territories and how you could package, bid for different packages, which as I said, I think you guys again set a very, very high standard, and I think a lot of the rest of the world tried to follow. And I do remember as well that, and I'm not sure you told me the story or someone else, that there was even some game theory involved where you look through this. Okay, if this person would bid this, and then the next one, what happens then? Can you talk a bit about that? That'd be, I think, fascinating to hear.
Sure. Well, that really came out of what was going on in England, in the UK, because by that stage the Premier League had become a hot property in British television. The satellite pay TV broadcasters really could not do without it, and therefore the government, the regulators, started to get a little bit involved, and essentially the Premier League had to make sure that its sales process moved from being a negotiated deal through to a squeaky clean, regulated official sales process,
Yep.
which included sealed bids, auctions, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we did was we essentially took that, because actually what we realized was that although we'd been forced to do this in the UK, that if you were clever with it, if you, as you said, if you built packages so that the broadcast, you put all the advantage with you, the broadcasters were kind of bidding blind, and and they basically, we feasted on their paranoia. That's what we did.
Yep.
They every time they might have thought this is the right number, they thought, yeah, but what happens if someone else bids more? We don't want to lose that package. And yeah, it paid off handsomely. And we took that system into all of our international rights sales as well. And I do think that also contributed to a massive increase in revenue as well.
No, no doubt about it. And we've obviously had some exchanges during that period of time, and the numbers were incredible. And you're right. There was a fear of missing out. FOMO was created, and obviously having multiple parties always interested in it. That's the whole trick. And you guys did an amazing job doing that.
You can't do it without competition. I mean, the bottom line is you've got to have competition in markets for your rights. Otherwise, forget about it. You're not going to get increases. Yeah. But if you have got a competitive market, and really, if you've got more than two, if you get upwards from three, then you can play some very interesting games. And
totally agree.
I mean, I remember we had situations where broadcasters could bid for regions, or they could bid for individual territories, and they would put in bids for both, end up bidding against themselves and making the price go up. It was for a salesperson, it was a joy at that time, I have to say.
Yeah, yep, I do remember some of those conversations we had, and it's a great segue into the next part really of our conversation. That is, the world now has obviously dramatically changed. I would argue the glory days of what we're talking about, and how these fees just continually grow, and you literally could see every year there was a nice additional increase, or year on year packages, depends on how it was sold. I think that world has gone. I believe it's the opposite is happening. Is that rights fees are either stagnant, and in some cases we've obviously know already they're going backwards. Although in some sense you would think that shouldn't be the case, because new technology has come in with OTT, new players have come in, but I think in some degree these new players have really destructed, or created a destruction in the rights fees, because it takes so much revenue away from the existing parties who have been feeding this, right? The pay TV operators, and maybe in some markets still there was always free to air. There was some good money there as well, but really pay TV who drove a lot of this, these massive rights fees we've just been talking about. But now you got a whole different, world out there, and I know you're obviously still involved in this very much with your agency now. So Let's talk a bit about that. What's your view in what's happening there right now?
Yeah, I think the world has changed, or is changing, and has changed pretty much out of all recognition. I think when I first went to the Premier League, one of the big changes I noticed in the first 5 years was I started to talk to a lawyer every day. I'd never done that before. Then after that, as the numbers, the money increased, I started to talk to a regulator every week. So governments got involved, and but the industry itself was still a bit like the Wild West. There was I needn't tell you, Marcus, there was tons of stuff going on that, and everybody was looking to make a buck. These days, I think it's even reached the stage where it's governments have got involved. It's become a nation state political tool, as you know. Football is such a major flag waving property. But you're right. What has happened is that the Wild West, the industry, which was very young, has grown up. When I was selling to pay TV broadcasters, and you're right, it was largely pay TV broadcasters, the guys who were making the decisions were doing it on gut instinct. I mean, I think, for example, Sky's big business strategy was to buy all the rights. That's it. Not let anyone else get any.
Yep.
Now, if you talk to those same pay TV broadcasters, they have a room of 25-year-old kids in suits doing analysis on data, and they can tell you pretty much what everything is worth. So if you go to them with some sports rights, they'll say, okay, if we buy these rights, we'll add this number of subscribers. If we lose these rights, we'll lose this number of subscribers. And they start to talk about things like the football subscriber. So, for example, Sky now has Premier League rights. They don't have Champions League rights. If they were able to buy the Champions League rights, they might do it, but there's a very good chance that they'd look at it and say, actually, how many new subscribers do we get with the Champions League? We've already got all these guys. It's the same guy.
Correct.
So that kind of analysis, which wasn't around, thankfully, when I was selling my rights, is now a major part of the fact that they're rationalizing how much they spend on their rights. I think the other thing you mentioned there, you mentioned OTT. I mean, for as long as I've been doing this, people have been talking new technology, because new technology is sexy, and there's a lot that I love about it. Yeah. But actually what I always say to people is, where's the new business model? It's great having new, ever more sophisticated delivery mechanisms. You can do this and you can do that. But actually the business model doesn't change. You're either going to get someone to pay you for watching, or you're going to get people, commercial companies, to pay you for eyeballs. It's either going to be advertiser funded or subscription. Correct. And no one has yet come up with something which changes that. So, it used to be when everything was about portals and the internet. Now it's about OTT, but actually it's pretty much the same revenue pool you're dipping into. So suddenly, if you get it does make me laugh when I see reports about how the sports rights is going to grow and grow and grow massively. And you're thinking, well, and they're saying it's because of OTT. And I go, yeah, well, but it's Peter robbing Paul. If someone launches an OTT channel with a great sports property on it, that's fantastic. And whoever gets those rights, and if they get their numbers right and the balance of what they pay for the rights and their number of subscribers, they'll make a lot of money. But that money is coming from the subscribers who will not now be spending it with a paid TV company. So
I agree.
Yeah, I don't see how there's a massive increase in the revenue pool. If anything, I think that's probably shrinking because we live in a time where younger people particularly only want to pay for what they want to watch. They don't want to pay monthly subscriptions, annual subscriptions, and they don't care about the rest of the stuff that's on the channel. They just want to pay for what they want to watch. Yeah. The trick of the pay TV broadcasters or the OTT guys is to give them what they want, so that they're paying just what they want to watch. and then they're going to find out that they're actually paying more. That would be that's what
it is. It's much more fragmented for sure. I think it's the unbundling is what I always call it world, really, where it is no longer about buying this big pay TV box and put it in your house and you have 200 channels where you watch 5 of them only anyway. It is really about those 3 or 4 or 5 channels I want, and sports hopefully is always a big part of that. People are still willing to pay for it. I think that there's plenty of research out there where that's proven. The question, of course,
I think people would pay for it.
Correct.
But
how much
Marcus, how much and how often and on what basis, and whether we're talking micropayments, which I think is quite interesting.
Yep.
And what will happen? Someone will aggregate. I mean, I've talked, as what I do now through my agency. I still work with governing bodies. I still try and do for them and help them in the way I help the Premier League. It's a much more difficult market now. But when I talk to them, often they talk about launching their own OTT channel. They say, well, if the rights revenue goes down from the broadcasters, we'll launch our own OTT channel. Yep. And I think they haven't taken on board really the what you got to be able to do that, the marketing, the distribution, the revenue collection, etc. So I think what will happen is I think it'll happen. I think as some sports get to a point where they're not getting money from pay TV, they'll launch their own OTT channel. But there's going to be someone who comes along and aggregates that. Someone's going to come along and say to them, hey, why do you want to mess with all of that stuff? I can do all that for you, and you can just slot your content in here. You want to have a channel for your sport? Here it is. It's on my platform. I'm doing all the marketing for this platform. I'm doing all the revenue collection, production, technical. Correct. You just got to. So it'll come round to that again, and I don't think that's going to change.
I agree, and we literally having exactly the same conversations here in Asia with leagues who are now saying, broadcasters are not lining up anymore, and Asian leagues are always having a tougher time than, let's say, the Premier League had in the past anyway, and therefore we have to go on our own. We have to create a direct-to-consumer business, and there are obviously companies who build OTT platforms now. You got plenty of them around the world. We're just going to hire one, and we're going to do it. And as you rightly said, that's as a concept makes sense. There is a lot of logic to it. The execution, as usual, is a lot harder to do, and this is sort of some of the work we're doing right now as well. But it's fun, and but I do believe, and I think you sort of almost said that in the same way. It will take a few years. It will shake itself out again, and there will be a new model, and there will be new revenue. Will it be really tremendously larger than it is right now, or does it have to go through a slump before it can turn again? No one, I think, has the answer. I've never heard anyone have a really good answer to it yet.
No, I think what I tell my clients is, it looks more like a correction than a blip. Yep. It doesn't look like it's going to just bounce back quickly. It looks like there's going to be a transformation time. I think you were right earlier when you said the new guys in town are disruptors. They for a long time, people were saying, hey, it'll be all right because if the pay TV guys don't stay on their toes and pay top dollar, the big Americans, Amazon and Facebook and Microsoft or Apple, they're all going to come in and they're going to pay loads of money instead. Well, actually, they haven't. They've been very clever. They're letting the market fall. I think they're all going to do their own thing in different ways, and they're certainly not all the same. But I think it's going to take time, as you say. And the other thing that makes me laugh a lot in the meantime is still the number of governing bodies who basically say, hey, OTT, we better launch an OTT channel, in the same way as they used to say, we better launch an internet website. And they basically say, we'll put our live sport on there. And I say, well, you can do that, but don't expect the people who are paying you big rights fees or any rights fees now to carry on paying you, because what you've got is one thing. You've got your rights. And if a lot of people want to watch your sport live, then you're very lucky. But you can't sell it more than once.
Correct.
It's live. Yep. That's it.
Yep,
So
absolutely. And we know that the pay world only works in a certain exclusive window, right? I mean, it doesn't work if you
yes,
are free out there on whatever platform, whether it's your own or YouTube or God knows where you're streaming, and still hoping to God that the guy who just bought your rights can make money with it if you just, blasting it around the world. It's just insane.
yeah, I talked to a very large American, let's say, new media company who were going to buy some Premier League rights in Asia that didn't in the end. So you
All right.
probably know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
But their plan was they were going to sub-license some live rights to pay TV broadcasts. And I said, well, good luck with that.
Yep.
Why would they want to take a sub-license from you guys?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is, sometimes it's amazing how, but it's, and this is where I think to wrap up this part of our little conversation here is, the world has changed, and I think as much as we all to some degree thought OTT would be adding to it, so you kind of keep the base and you keep just growing from there. The opposite I think is a bit true, right? We're definitely seeing a dip there, and it will be interesting to see how it swings out, in the next few years. I guess we'll be there and watching it for sure and be part of it in some fashion, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I want to do a little bit, always one part of the conversation with someone like yourself is learnings, right? You've had an illustrious career in many, many organizations and now, of course, running your own business. What are the sort of learnings you've had you would share with someone here, both on the positive side, and then later we talk about some of maybe the failures of where you feel things didn't go so well. So, but let's start always with a good positive note here. What some of the things you would share from your career?
Well, it's interesting. I started off first and foremost, I was a football fan, and I started writing about football, and I've watched football all my life. I still go for pleasure as well, for business, to football matches,
Right.
and I found that there's pretty much a metaphor for everything that you need to do and think about in life in football. So, teamwork. That if you're putting a team together, you need a balance of different types of people. You need to believe in yourself, believe in what you're doing. That having one skill set is not enough. You've got to continue to develop yourself, and that timing is everything. That being ahead of the game is as pointless as being behind the game. So
Yeah.
all of those things I kind of got from football. Although probably the one metaphor, if it's not a metaphor, but just a smart thing that I heard said was, I think it was Gary Player who said the famous thing about, the harder I practice, the luckier I get. So it is, in the end, a lot of it is about putting in the hard yards, putting in the work, the effort, rolling up your sleeves and believing in what you're doing. It's interesting because for the past, couple of decades, I've been giving a couple of speeches a year to university students who are thinking about going into the sports industry, which was a kind of industry that didn't really even exist when I was
This is in the UK
studying.
or which university?
This is in the UK, yeah.
Right, okay, great.
And I always start off by saying to them, well, how many of you want to work in the sports industry because you like playing sport? Some hands go up, and I go, well, you shouldn't go into the sports industry because when everybody else is playing sport, you're going to be working.
Right.
So don't go into it for that reason. And then the next thing you got to think about is, am I going into this because I love a particular sport? Well, if you love football, then that's great. Go into the football industry, but be aware of two things. Number one, if you're successful, yep, you can make a lot of money, but you're going to be up against an awful lot of other people. There's a lot of money in football, but there's a lot of competition for those people trying to work in it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if your passion is, for example, weightlifting, that's great because you're not going to find too much competition to get into weightlifting. But hey, there's not a lot of money in weightlifting either. So you've got to be prepared to do something for the love of what you do rather than financial reward. So I think there's a lot of things that people don't see on the outside until you get into it. And I certainly didn't start off with any kind of career plan. As you know, I started off writing about doing match reports on West Ham and the Sheffield clubs. So, I didn't see any of this coming, to be honest with you, Marcus. And it just grew bit by bit. So I think you just have to, and I know it was the same for you. You do one thing and it leads to another. Absolutely. And you get some that work and some that don't. I've been very lucky. That's the thing you need more than anything else. You need luck. Yeah. I was very lucky that Richard Scudamore decided that I could do something for the Premier League, and I did it. I think you got to have faith in your ability to transform things, to change things. Most of the time, I've succeeded in that. But as you mentioned, there've been some there where I haven't been able to do it.
Yeah. So talk a bit about what do you see in your career, whether with some of the agencies or certain roles you had, maybe where it didn't work so well.
Well, with I left the Premier League to join CAA, huge American agency, and they had some very ambitious plans to dominate the world, to rival IMG. But essentially it didn't work out because when it came to it, the guys who wanted to do it were too used to the way that they worked in America. I mean, that's one big lesson for all of us, that America is very different. Its sports model is very different. Its broadcasting model is different. There's a lot of stuff that comes over from America, but when Americans try to do things outside America, they're usually a little bit surprised at how big the world is and how different it is to America. And sometimes, they get nervous and they get cold feet. I think that's a little bit of what happened with CAA. But I would have to say that, during my time at CAA, they sold a third of the company for multi-million dollars. To an equity company. Right. So part of me thinks, okay, it didn't really work out. We set up the London office and we were going to conquer the world, and that didn't work out. But on the other hand, they sold a third of the company for a very large sum of money, so maybe it did work out. So
maybe there was a different plan there. That's true. And I do remember those times. We were actually doing some stuff together. I think we were working on some in a particular football project in India, which I'm sure you recall. But you also had obviously some big partners with you in CA when you guys set up. I mean, you were really a heavyweight team there, and on the back of it, I think the expectation were then equally high, right?
I think that's right, and I think we could have done some huge things, but in the end, I think that they weren't the people who were running CAA were in a different business. They've been used to not taking huge gambles. They've been used to representing Hollywood stars and taking 10% of their earnings. So theirs was a kind of, can I negotiate a good role for Leonardo DiCaprio and make some money on it? That's a very different world to the kind of ballsy world that we work in, Marcus, where you have to put down a big number and take the risk and hope you can make a small percentage. Yeah. So I think they got cold feet. But like I say, I think one of the lessons I've learned in my time in this industry is not everything is always as it seems. And some things, where you don't feel have been a success. Well, actually, they might have been a success for someone else, because I think CEA did very well out of that time of saying what it was going to do. Right. Yeah. And when I went to Lagadere, I went from there to Lagadere. Unfortunately, that was just, I mentioned earlier, bad timing. By the time I arrived at Lagadere, I think Arno Lagadere had decided that he didn't want to do that anymore, and so essentially, it wasn't much fun for me, because there were a number of agencies within Lagadere that I was responsible for, and they were never going to grow anymore. The blood supply was being cut off to them, so it wasn't much of a fun time for me, that, and that certainly had some influence on me deciding, okay, I need to do my own thing now. And the funny thing about that has been that as you know, Marcus, I've spent nearly all my career working internationally. Yeah. It's been a fantastic privilege for me to have spent so much time traveling and seeing the world. And actually, when I set up my own business, suddenly everybody wanted to hire me to do things in the UK. So since then, I've been working for. I guess, right? It's a big change, So I've been working for the FA and the Football League and helped them with their deals. And now I'm which is part international, of course, is I'm working in rugby, which has been fascinating. Different shaped ball, different game.
That's for sure.
But some of the same issues.
Yeah, I want to come back for a minute to CAA and Lagadere. In Lagadere, of course, we all know, not besides the times when you were there, they've fallen even on harder times to some degree, especially here in Asia. Obviously, losing the football league the football rights to the AFC, and at least from what I hear on the back of it, of course, there's major changes going on in that. So they for sure is an interesting example of how someone had a vision there when Lagadere started, but it hasn't quite worked out. Now there's the other example of friends from CAA, and they're sort of, let's call it offspring CAA 11, where they've gone in there and bought obviously major rights of European football, the UEFA side of it, and on the back of it, again, how well they're doing, I don't know. Actually, I don't know really the numbers, but at least on paper, it looks like it's all heading sort of in the right direction. What's your thought on all those things happening?
I think that the day of the big agency is probably over. I think, let's put it this way. I wouldn't launch or try to be involved in a big agency now. There's been times over the last 5 years where people have come up to me and said, "Hey, why don't we start a big agency? I can get the backing for it." I don't think that's the way to go now. I think that the major properties are very good at selling themselves. I mean, the trend that I started when I went to the Premier League of doing deals directly with broadcasters, well, Premier League has done that ever since. A lot of the other governing bodies have done that. They've cut out the middleman. They've cut out the agency. So it's a very limited world that they're operating in, and the crown jewels don't need them. If you add to that a falling rights market, then it's a pretty tough time to be a major agency. I think what will come out of it, and we've seen, Infront recently had a very disappointing IPO on the New York Exchange. IMG pulled its flotation on the eve of its going to market because they were worried about what was going to happen. We've seen MP and Silver, that's gone.
Absolutely.
I don't think that we're going to see big comebacks or new agencies emerging. I think what will happen is you will see more what you might call boutique operations, maybe bigger than mine. I mean, I like to work as a one-man band. I sometimes join up with other people who provide things that I don't do, like market research. But I like to work to work as a one-man band. But what I do say is that anyone who's operating a small boutique operation, they might be that they specialize on certain types of sport, but they've all got to offer what I call 360 these days. They've got to be able to be more than just saying, I'll give you a minimum guarantee for your property and I'll go and sell it. Absolutely. They've got to be actually able to advise you on digital transformation. They've got to be able to be a complete 360 consultancy, which is, what I try and set out to be. So it's not just a case of getting your rights and selling them. You've got to help them with the strategy, long-term, medium-term. You've got to think what's coming next and how they're set up for it. It's a much more complex matrix than it was when I first went into the industry.
Yeah, I would, and I totally agree. When you're talking, this is pretty much exactly what we're doing now as well. We're becoming much more, I would say, consulting driven. So we still then deliver and help them find the revenue streams and generate that, but it's not about putting this big MGs on the table anymore. There's very few who can literally afford it, but also even if you do it, we've seen it with some of our competitors who, when they were bidding against us and they put these huge numbers on it, we know then afterwards they were all losing money on it, right? And so it's just because you have an executive in some part of the world who feels he knows the number and he can make it back for you, the guy who sits in headquarters and if he signs off on it believing that is the guy who runs his office in Asia or wherever in the world knows it, what he's going to do. He's going to burn a hole in the pocket. He might fire the guy, but this is, he's never going to get his money back. So I think exactly the approach has to change, and it is changing dramatically. We have some consulting roles here now, exactly like what you're just talking about, and similar to what you do in Europe, where the role is just very different, where you're not, you are sitting truly on the same table with the stakeholder, rather than you in a sense buying it and you're almost on the other side, right?
I think that's right.
Or you get stuck in the middle then all of a sudden, right? And we've seen that with agencies which they buy out rights and they get in the middle of broadcasters and everyone else, and then they get squeezed out, because everyone knows they have the risk now on them. So definitely an interesting time for agencies, I think, anywhere in the world, and we will all keep seeing and talking about, I'm sure, when we all meet at Sportel again in a few weeks. So that's, I'm sure, going to be one of the topics there. But before we head there, we're getting close to our sort of cool down phase here, and part of it, a little bit about maybe share with what you're doing at the moment, what's your own plans, a little or a message you have for the inspiring sports executives out here.
Okay, well, I think it's an extremely different world that people would be getting into than the one I got into. Like I say, it was more like the Wild West. It's now becoming much more regulated, for better and for worse. One thing we didn't mention actually was piracy. I think that's becoming a much more sophisticated problem. It's a huge topic, and that's something that's going to be spoken a lot about at Sportel. I do think that's another reason that you have to be a little bit careful about putting big numbers down for rights, because other people are taking them and using them for free, and as you know, Marcus, that's reached some pretty high levels in every sense these days in terms of who's pirating them, the scale of it. So that's one thing I think people would have to take into consideration.
I do remember you were doing some work for the AFC, which has obviously gone out there and created this huge new deal with the group out of China for reportedly somewhere around $3.5 or $4 billion. Share a little bit of your thoughts on it, and I'll add mine to it later too.
Well, it was a fascinating project for me. I spent a couple of years working for the AFC, spent a lot of time out in Kuala Lumpur, and at that time they were coming into the sort of last cycle of an 8-year rights deal, and they wanted to sell their rights in a different way. They wanted to take on board exactly what you were talking about earlier that I'd instilled with the Premier League. They wanted to have a clean sales process, regulated, official, and auction. So I spent a lot of time with them working out how we could do it and the packaging and talking to potential bidders, working up the market, which you have to do.
Yep.
And as you know, Marcus, I didn't see it through. Before the auction took place, there were a couple of things that made me pretty nervous about what was happening, and I didn't want to be associated with it, so I walked away. But the auction went ahead, and they got as you say, a very big number for their rights, and now they have to, that agency and we haven't talked about them because it's almost like a specific agency for that one property. They have to go and try and get a return on their investment. I think it's, given everything else we've said about the rights market, it's not going to be easy for them, given what I earlier referred to in terms of piracy. As you know, that will severely affect that part of the world. So I don't think it's going to be easy for the AFC, but they did get a big number, so that's good for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think from a rights holder, if they get the money, and assuming they will, then fantastic for them. Clearly, the group who bought it is going to face all the challenges we've been talked about the last hour because of the changes. So it isn't the automatic, there will be a higher fee just because now I own it. You have to, remember the crazy days of Luer Sports in China, which were throwing money around like crazy. Well, they're not around anymore, right? And I don't see anyone there coming anywhere close putting these sort of numbers in China on the table. And so I think it's an interesting time. Of course, when you hear presentations from the group there, it's all sounds great, and I think they have great plans and they have a great team of people there. But I do wish them good luck and be watching what happens there. I sort of I have my doubts that these numbers will all add up, but who knows?
It's tough. I mean, one thing I would say is that, and my appreciation of this grew during my time working with the AFC, is just the size, just the scale of what you're trying to do. I mean, one can have philosophical debates about what Asia is and what is the commonality between the countries that make up Asia. Yeah. But in football terms, when you think that the football version of Asia embraces Australia, Korea, the Middle East, and the Central Asian countries as well, and everything in between. You think, well, the dichotomies, the differences between those different territories in economic wealth, in football ability, in stadia size, in broadcasting sophistication. I mean, there's some territories within there that don't even have any laws relating to intellectual property. Yep. So that makes it, you can try and copy a European model, but actually it's very different and it's very big. And that, I think, that doubles the challenge, probably.
I totally agree. Yeah, and now we could go on forever here because there's so many fun topics we could pick on, but I think we also need to be conscious of our time. So, Phil, I'd love to thank you for this great chat. It's always been a pleasure, and I'm sure we'll see you soon again somewhere, whether Sportel or another part of the world. And thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure, as always, to chat with you, Marcus, and I hope that I've been able to give anyone listening a little bit of insight and help. Thanks again.
Fantastic. Thank you. Talk to you later.
Speak soon.
Cheers. Bye. Bye-bye.
The Sports Entrepreneurs by Marcus Luer podcasts are a collection of interviews and stories. All content in this podcast is the copyright of Marcus Luer. Reproduction and distribution of the presentation without written permission of the owner is prohibited. All rights reserved.